I don't know. Okay, so like reasons why I also have trouble with these questions is that I think Jo Weldon or Jo Boobs in New York City, she runs the New York School of Burlesque, had a really great quote that that she said during a talk I saw her give at BurlieCon, which is a burlesque convention in Seattle. Yes. I was lucky to go to this year. And she was saying, she said something like, the trouble with like making assertions about like burlesque versus stripping or whatever is that like every strip club is so different, and every, you know what I mean? Just like every burlesque show is really different. So
and every burlesque performer and every stripper.
Exactly, right? So when we make like a sweeping statement about like the nature of stripping, like there are certainly sort of general truths, but they don't even apply to every strip club. Like, for sure. I was reading a book right now, and it's becoming part of my dissertation, because my dissertation is about exoticism. So it's about the ways that bodies who are read as ethnically othered are read in like a neo-burlesque perspective, and I compare it through history to now.
Can you even explain that for me?
What that is?
Break that down a little bit.
Okay, so we talked a lot about Lydia Thompson, the British Blondes. Shortly thereafter, maybe about like I would say about 20 years after, roughly. In 1893, a really important event happened in Chicago, which was the Chicago World Fair. And this event had a huge sort of, I guess, like ability to reshape the way that performing and performance genres happened in North America thereafter. Part of this was because part of the World Fair was that they would bring in attractions from different parts of the world. The idea was that you could go to this fair and experience the whole globe in this one little location. Something similar to, I mean, it certainly wasn't, but the idea was much like maybe like Epcot at Disney or something. Okay. Like this kind of like taste it all, whatever. But all of it is, you know, fabricated and super whatever, and it's not like an authentic
interpretation of each culture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the most popular attractions was this little area called a street in Cairo. And there were a series. Well, there's a lot of different points of contention about this, but there was a series of dancers who were all working under a pseudonym entitled Little Egypt. Okay. Sorry, I like started with that, Little Egypt. Yeah. And basically, the big like importance of that was that this is the moment when like belly dancing is introduced to North America, and people lost their minds because. You have to remember, like at this period of time, it was like the Victorian era in Europe, so people were like so corseted and wearing bustles, and so like no dancing. Like maybe like the best you have is like maybe a piano, which like one member of the family can play, and everything is very calm. People are terrified of any sort of like real expression of sexuality. Yeah. And so, you know, and like the belly dance costumes then were nothing like they are now. It was like the women were fully covered too, but they were just in loose clothing that showed their form and showed their like undulations. And people really like flipped out. And so that, in combination with, unfortunately, aspects of minstrel shows, like blackface minstrel shows that were happening in the States, amalgamated together to sort of become a part of burlesque theaters, which... so the Chicago Fair happened in 1893. By the early 20th century, burlesque shows were like were working class entertainment form, predominantly for male audiences. And they were originally comedy shows with comics, not really stand-up comics, more like Abbott and Costello.
Okay, yeah.
Started in burlesque, actually. It was kind of like burlesque was the lowest tier. You worked really hard in burlesque, and you maybe made your way to vaudeville, was like the way it worked. And so eventually cooch dancers or hoochie cooch dancers, which sort of comes from that Little Egypt tradition and other Orientalist traditions that are happening, become a part of the show. And eventually at some point, and this is contested by a lot of people, those dancers began to strip. Began to strip. And this was mixed with other elements of like black social dance, like things like shimmies and shakes, and like which were popularized by people like Mae West. And so in neo burlesque, what happens is, and I'm really skipping forward and leaving a lot out. Neo burlesque is interesting in that it merges the comics and the strippers into one uniform act. Not to say that wasn't happening before. Like a lot of the sort of post-war burlesque, or even as early as Gypsy Rose Lee, was like inherently very funny.
Very funny, yeah.
But that you're really like bringing both of those together. But also that neo burlesque, you know, continues to carry some of these kinds of like these exotic, quote unquote, where we get the roots of the words exotic dance, like regarding strippers, sort of undertones that continue to be reperformed, and that those readings affect different performers differently, especially in divides between performers who read as white and performers who read as people of color or POC, or even just as ethnically diverse. Like that this affects even people who are, you know, like European, like maybe like that someone who is Spanish is, you know, sort of like the expectation is that you're playing to that, or like I'm Portuguese almost entirely, and like I don't think people know how to ask me to play Portuguese, but it certainly is a way that like is a way that I'm kind of read or like asked to rearticulate, especially because like I'm quite dark, and so a lot of people assume that I'm Middle Eastern off the get-go. And so like when I begun burlesque, especially like a couple years ago, I think this is a little bit different now for the better, which is great. There was like a huge amount of pressure to like play into this thing that wasn't even like, you know, like it is a little bit like there's a part of my culture that's that is like kind of like of Arab descent, but it's quite far back. It colors me, but it's not like my cultural experience for sure. But this sort of like idea that I could play to what I presented like, and that I'd be comfortable with that, or that I wanted to do that, was incredibly uncomfortable and really like pushed my project to be what it is now.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Because that's bringing it back to drag. That's another thing that is very prevalent in drag. I feel like the way somebody presents ethnically, they can use that for comedic purposes. Like they can really push that if they so choose to. And it's like, it can get you in some kind of murky territory.
Totally. But also like, you know, no shade for people like some people find it really celebratory to reclaim that
too,
because like there
on
is
the flip side,
exactly, right? So like it's not a thing for one to be able to prescribe, but certainly like, you know, that there are real consequences that historically have always been a thing that are affecting people even today. Like, I mean, I was listening to the podcast before I came on.
To my podcast?
Yeah, oh yeah, don't worry. I'm a researcher by trade.
Like, oh, that's true.
You know what I mean?
You probably listen to all of them.
Well, I mean, like there's a lot, but you know, and I definitely took extra special attention to friends of mine who had been in previous episodes. So like
who? Let's plug some episodes.
I was just getting to like Jeannie Emerald's episode where she talks about what it's like to be dark skinned and a Black woman and working in burlesque, and so like I mean, for her, that history is so ingrained, is so long running, and is so like really problematic deeply, down to, you know, what dancers used to be able to get paid, down to where they get booked, and frankly even now like in the corporate sector, where people can and can't work. And I mean like Jeannie, Jeannie does a lot of wonderful corporate work, and she is so beautiful and articulate and fabulous. But
all those
like
things.
Exactly, right? And so I can't speak to exactly like what she's experienced or hasn't, but just knowing that this is like a really pervasive thing for so many people in the industry,
for sure,
especially like where shadism.
Yeah, just down to like, do I want to book a Black performer in this slot? Like, do I already have a Black performer? But also, so like, how messed up is that? You know, that's like, what I'm saying. Yeah, like down to like, just all the ways that people of color can be affected in this industry. Like right down to like, do I want a Black person here? No, I think we just had a Black performer. So let's have, you know, like just they have to be peppered in somehow. Like just all these stupid little considerations that people who are not of color will make like at the drop of the hat on any whim,
and that
to
it's
book or not,
right?
Yeah, to book or not book people of color. It's
and even things like, I think that boils down to there's a really incredible scholar whose work I really admire, named Siobhan Brooks, and in her book Unequal Desires, I think it's called like Race and Erotic Capital or something like that. It's about strip clubs and the way that they function. And she coins this term called erotic capital. And the way that she basically explains that is like, well, how much are you worth in the erotic market? So that's not actually about like how many people on an actual level are or are not attracted to you, or how many feet. Like, it's kind of a check and balance with things like basically like visible race, body size, physical ability or disability, and sort of checking and balancing all those things in the way that you're read, so that the woman who is the feature dancer typically, or the woman who's like doing really well, especially in mainstream corporatized strip clubs, is typically, you know, a white,
lean,
able-bodied, lean woman with probably a certain chest or bum size, with certain kinds of features and with a certain kind of performability or performance style. And we see that, you know, all through the media and all through like the kind of the world, but certainly as much as burlesque, what's amazing about burlesque is how incredibly radical it is in dismantling those things.
Yeah, I agree. That might be one of, if we're going to get back to kind of the difference between the stripper sphere and the burlesquing world. I think that might be it. The burlesque, at least now, and at least here in Toronto, really liberal city, we're seeing different body types. We're seeing people with different skin colors. We're seeing different levels of being disabled, or from being disabled to being able-bodied, different ages. We're seeing a lot more diversity as to like representations of beauty and sexiness, and perhaps not seeing that so much in like the stripper world.
For sure. Like, and I mean, and that those checks and balances change depending on different factors, right? Where like typically if you're a white performer and you're a stripper, you can be a lot older and still be working versus like, you know, like women who read of color or like darker skinned Black women especially, typically, I mean, from conversations I've had with people, can't work as long because it's like too many checks and balances that don't add up to what the club feels can
like
be profitable.
Too many intersections.
Yeah, too many negative, in air quotes, intersections.
Right.
Yeah. Which I mean, hopefully is not a thing. But also like to be aware that as much as burlesque is so progressive, that certainly there are shows that keep up that idea of erotic capital. Certainly there are shows that profit off of that.
Sure.
And I think, you know, it's just like being realistic with ourselves about the fact that they exist and how to mitigate or navigate around them is an important aspect as a burlesque dancer and community advocate. I think we all have to kind of keep in mind.
For sure. And as show producers like yourself, yourself and I. Yeah.
Actually, I've never produced.
Really? Oh, I thought you did. You're doing a burlesque series.
I do. Okay, so I
produce.
Right? I don't produce a burlesque series, which is like, I mean, confusing maybe, but
you're like, I do and I don't. But
yes, exactly. We actually haven't booked burlesque yet. We're really excited to.
Cool.
But I produce a feminist cabaret called Crème de la Femme. We're really lucky to be a part of the Buddies Pride season this year. I think we're on June 14th, if I have that correct.
That's my birthday, if that's correct.
Oh my God, please come. we should be like,
birthday party.
Like,
that would be my thing that I get all my friends to come
yes,
see this
please.
year.
Oh my God, it would be so wonderful.
Oh, that's amazing.
And the way that it works is Crème de la Femme is basically the purpose is to bring people in who identify as performers of any kind to discuss their relationship with femininity as a radical counter to a sort of like patriarchal kind of like
lens.
Which I think so much of the rest of the work is in. Part of what makes us really radical is that we're really open to anyone being in that conversation or applying. So we have no gender or sexuality limit on who can apply.
Love it.
So, you know, and part of that was so that we could encourage people who maybe didn't feel like they were femme or effeminate to still talk about femininity, because in doing that, we hope that they would be able to build a relationship with it. Because I think so many of us, especially people who are mask presenting or feel attracted to masculinity or performing or embodying masculinity, either because they've been conditioned to, like a lot of cis men, or because, you know, like that's where they feel right, like a lot of trans men or maybe non-binary people. Taking that in, like taking a certain level of performing patriarchy actually does, I think, real damage to the spirit, because it cuts you off from other elements of yourself that I think need drastic attention. Things like vulnerability and expression and compassion, you know, and